Well, here we are now with voice and all. So, welcome everyone. We were watching a little bit of a slide there for a while, which is the California Portuguese American Coalition and the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute from Fresno State, putting together this post-election event here for CPAC. And as always, we thank Vlad for being a partner with both CPAC and PBBI. We thought it'd be important to talk about the elections in Portugal with a key figure in the Portuguese American community who himself has been involved in a few elections in his lifetime. That's a different life of the past. It may be a different life may come back in the future. One never knows in politics. But that is our good friend, Senator Dan da Ponte, who for many years was a state senator in the state of Rhode Island. Dan, thanks for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, it's my pleasure. And of course, this is just another election cycle in Portugal, a snap election, as I like the term that is being used by the English language political press in Europe. Political European Union calls it a snap election. I've never heard of the term before, but I guess it was something that, and we've explained to folks who have been following us, that basically the PS could not get its budget approved with its partners on the left, the PCP, the Portuguese Communist Party, and the left bloc, the Bloc de Esquerda, and so they called for elections. That's what that's what happens in the parliamentary system, and so the elections are being were held today. We're about the movement goes a lot faster than in the United States. I mean, it seems like polls just closed about 3 hours ago, a little over, and they already have many results. Of course, the first projections, but many results. It seems like the PS is going to maintain its majority. May not be enough to govern by itself, but it will definitely be enough to govern with maybe just one of the political forces to the left or one political force to the right. It depends. My first question to you, and just as a thought, one of the things that is interesting is how the polls were kind of wrong on this. I mean, 45 to 60 days ago, when this whole process began, these preliminary polls showed that the PS would beat the PSD, which is a center-right party. We should say the PS is center-left, by 10 to 12 points. And then just this last week, it said the best that the PS would be able to pull would be maybe a 3-point advantage. Now it seems like they're going to pull anywhere between an 8 to 10 points. So once again, polls are wrong, not just in the United States, and it seems like they've been wrong in France. They've been wrong in other countries. What's your read on this? Because you've been working with polls all of your political life.
Well, it's certainly interesting. I think that the two things that sort of come to mind regarding, the challenges, I think, with polling, and it's definitely happened here in the States, whether it's national elections or state and local elections. I think two, which I think is also prevalent in Portugal, two main factors. One, the element of early voting. That regardless of how it's done, I mean, there is a segment of the vote that happens before election day, and then the second is the ability or inability, frankly, to contact those that are being asked to participate in a poll. I mean, we don't have a home phone. Mm-hmm. Our mobile phones are not listed in the old white pages, and so I think as that transitions as well. I mean, those are two things that come to mind in terms of how polling has been, more and more difficult as time goes on. And then, I don't know that it's a significant percentage of the respondents, but either those folks that choose not to answer or choose not to be, truthful in how they answer, because that's another thing for those folks with respect to the sophistication of the technology. I don't know about Portugal, but here, when you do have sort of this robo-polling that takes place, the respondent is recorded in terms of how they responded to the question. So now there's a record of how they choose to vote. So there could be any number of factors as to why folks may or may not feel comfortable or they may, whatever. But I think at the end of the day, as technology evolves, as people's opinions, frankly, evolve. I mean, some folks might not, make a decision until they, actually fill in the blank in terms of who they're going to vote for. So I think, and as times get more and more interesting, let's say, folks are more and more informed. Some of that information that's out there, as we know, is not correct, is not accurate, is not truthful, is fabricated in some cases. So, these are all, I think, variables that go into sort of, what results you get as of late.
Indeed, and I think that sometimes pollsters are polling, as you mentioned, the old-fashioned way. In other words, they're still going to people who have a landline, and that is an older voter here in America. And I would probably say the same thing to Portugal. It is still that older, a certain generation of people who still hang on to a landline, and so there's a lot more change. One thing, though, in Portugal, there was 18 political forces running, and this is quite unique to us here in the United States. And I vote in the Portuguese elections. I don't know why, but I do, and it's one of those things. It's as a dual citizen, you have the right to do it, and I'm registered, so I did. And I actually took a picture and put it on social media, and a couple of my American friends who have nothing to do with the Portuguese community sent me some personal messages saying, "How do you even decipher all that?" I mean, there's like 18 different forces there. But for a parliamentary system, that can be a plus. Or what is your take on that, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I don't think that the polarization that we're living here in the U.S. is unique to us. I think this polarization, again, driven by sort of a feed in terms of information, in terms of biases. So, whatever your opinion is, whatever your political bent is, there is a source out there that's going to feed and reinforce how you see the world and how you see things. I think when you get into a multi-party system in a parliamentary system like you have in Portugal, even though you have all this polarization, and obviously the government that is just finishing up is an example of that, as is the governing situation in the Azores. It forces coalitions, and it forces folks to, and political leaders and parties to, I think, set aside those things and those issues that they're never going to find any agreement on, but try to focus on the things that they can find some common ground, they can find, some compromise. I mean, there's been, talk that, there's a need for some kind of a third party here in the U.S. to try to find or strike a similar balance, right? I mean, as it goes right now, I think you have a situation here where the Republican Party is much more disciplined in terms of sort of this, top down. If you're either going to get in line or you're not, and you've seen some of the collateral effects of some of those decisions on the Lynn Cheneys of the world and the Adam Kitzingers and those that are not in lockstep with the Trump Republican base. The Democratic Party, obviously, and you see that the opposite end in the Senate is like it's much more group and subgroup based, where you have it's a much harder set of opinions, set of perspectives to get on the same page, and that's that presents a governing challenge. But I do think that with all of this extreme polarization, there really is the need, whether it's in a parliamentary system that has 19 to 20 parties running an election, or frankly a two-party system like we have here in the States. I think it's definitely time for the electeds and even the parties to really try to focus on the things that they can find some consensus on, and not waste time and not waste political capital and energy on the things that they're just never going to find any agreement on.
Indeed. And I know you follow, of course, Portuguese politics. I mean, sometimes it's a chore because of all of the different things that go on and all different nuances. And for those of Americans of Portuguese ancestry here who are second, third, fourth generation, of course, folks don't follow other than maybe what comes up in the news. But it's not like Portugal is in the U.S. news, all the time, unless you follow some European news. It was said that this was kind of a political maneuver by the PS to get what is called an absolute majority in order to govern. It is said, and there's been plenty of it written and said, by the political pundits in Portugal of all leniencies, not just left wing or right wing, of every political perspective, that they could have given something to the two parties that they were in with, which was called, the Portuguese word geringonça, which we all learned about 5 years ago. And so it was said that, the PS decided, no, we're not going to give in a little bit to some of the things that Left Bloc and the Portuguese Communist Party were asking. And within the, we'll never know the truth, of course, within the circle of the political spectrum of the PS. But it's been said that some of the leadership in the PS said, now let's just go to elections. We can win this. And indeed, what happened was that they may not get the full majority to win. They're only going to be off if things go the way they continue. And it pretty much, we got what already like almost 70% of the vote counted. So it seems like they may only need one small political party. So they did go and pick up votes, and it seems like they picked up votes from the left, because both the Communist and the Left Bloc lost tremendously. Not just to the PS, but they also lost, of course, to the Chega movement. And so, from a political standpoint, this seems to be a move that panned out for the PS.
Well, yeah, I'm sure that there's an element of this that might have been just political stratagem, saying, hey, sooner or later we're going to have elections anyway. Our two coalition partners are not, playing nice in the sandbox, at least according to what how we see things. So
Sure.
we're going to just roll the dice and see what happens. Whether or not that criticism is appropriate or not, that there was that deft political maneuvering. I don't know, but I think at the end of the day, what is very clear is that the parties, and I think most of the players are not, they're not newbies in terms of unknowns to the electorate, right? So even though it was a snap election, even though there's all these potential thoughts of what what might have been behind all of this. I mean, at the end of the day, the Portuguese electorate was given the opportunity to vote, and they voted the way they did. I think with the Chega party, which is one of the newer, sort of hard right parties. I mean, they sort of represent, and I think they have a following of those folks that are just sort of anti-establishment in a pretty hard way. And I think just following sort of what goes on in Portugal and in Portuguese politics, I think it's always that, like here, it's that middle of the road voter that's the quietest, but is the ultimate decider in these elections. So it's the extremes that make all the noise. It's the extremes that get all the attention. But at the end of the day, it's the moderate, middle of the road voter, I think, that has the final say in what happens. And when you look at the sort of breakout as of right now in terms of how things settled, I think folks, the Portuguese electorate chose overwhelmingly to just sort of stay the course, not rock the boat, have a stable government, a stable leadership, even if you don't agree with everything that they do, and also know. I think the PSD was probably penalized in a way, not that I think they made it pretty clear that they didn't have many, real intentions to have some kind of a coalition, government per se with Chega. And although the Chega party is supporting the Azorian arrangement, but I do think that there was this probably underlying fear that, the PSD would be sort of forced in some way, shape or form to have to negotiate or have to include or have to incorporate Chega into an eventual coalition government. And I think folks probably just decided to stay the course and not rock the boat.
Yeah. Do you think that was going to be my question, actually, and my thought? I'm a firm believer that part of the, from a purely perspective and analytical, aspects, and that one of the reasons that the PS did as well as they did is because of that possibility that the PSD would make a coalition with the Shiga, and I think that scared some people in the center.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I think when you look at, even though the PS might be center left and PSD might be more center right, I mean, at the end of the day, they probably have more in common than they do not. I mean, they're both center majority parties. Whether they could ever do some grand coalition, probably not, in part because of personalities and other things involved. But nonetheless, I think that at the end of the day, the calculus for the electorate was, hey, based on this outcome, we're going to have a middle of the road, moderate, government, and a majority opposition party that's, got some distinct differences from the governing party, but, not too far off.
And the Shiga movement, the Shiga rise, basically, because they went from one deputy to maybe they'll have 5 or 6 in the parliament. They will probably end up with, they in some aspects, I think they will be the third most voted political force in Portugal, with big differences. I mean, if you go from, if the PS gets around 40% and the PSD gets, around 30%, and the Shiga gets 6%, that's a big difference to be a third political party. But it usually is in Portugal. The third political party, when it was the left bloc, they had, 8 or 9%. The communists have been third political force, and, they had 9 or 10. The CSD has been the third political force, again, with the same thing. But do you think that this right-wing populism, I mean, it only went up to like again 6.5 to 7%, but that's a big increase. Do you think that is just echo of what happened in other European countries, and it's happening somewhat in our country as well, a little bit toned down now, post-Trump era, but still, do you think that this is just an echo of what's going on, or is it kind of some of the old guard of the Portuguese, Salazar and Catano, dictatorship? Some of the people that followed that having a home there. And the second part to that question, do you believe, my part of the way I analyze it is that the Shiga has risen, part of it because the CDS has disappeared. They basically, in my perspective, have taken the CDS role, which, the CDS used to have 8, 9, 10%. And I think with this election, they may have 1% if they do that. They may not even have any parliamentary representation. And so is the Shiga just being a force that is getting some of these disgruntled people in the rights, or is it really, a new all populist movement, or a combination of both? What do you think?
I think it's probably a combination of both. I mean, I've thought about the Shiga party when I compare it to, U.S. politics as a fusion of the Tea Party movement and the Trump MAGA movement, in that, the Tea Party movement was sort of anti-establishment, anti a lot of things, or, in favor of certain things, but there really wasn't a person, so to speak, that was sort of the face and the voice and the symbol of the Tea Party movement. There were some members of Congress and some folks that might have been a little bit, more out front than others, but it was generally more of just a group that was organized and was able to make noise and get their point. They had a caucus in Congress that, when the Republicans controlled the House, John Boehner was the speaker, had a difficult time, negotiating and corralling with the Tea Party, folks. And then you have the MAGA movement, which, does have an icon and a symbol. And I think Shiga, has both those things. I mean, they've got, folks that gravitate to them that are just anti-establishment, just fed up with whatever it is they're fed up about. And, there are legitimate reasons that these folks and folks anywhere, I think, can be fed up. But I think they also owe it to themselves to sort of, dig a little deeper and find out more of why, and not just sort of based on what they, hear and some, talking points that they might catch on a news channel or a feed that is in accordance to their bent. And so I think that's, and then you have a spirited sort of leader in Shiga that, is well spoken, and he, speaks those catchphrases and says those things that, that folks will pay attention to, and he's not afraid to, he's not afraid to push the limits in terms of, when it comes to debates, when it comes to calling, other political leaders out for certain positions that they've taken or certain governmental decisions that they've made. And so I think, as information just continues to be more and more available, and as these, avenues for information continue to be, more and more available in the public domain, I think you're always going to have probably a more noticeable element of the population and the electorate that's going to be sort of anti and sort of populist. I don't think that's going away. Specifically comparing to the place that Shiga took as far as CDS. I mean, CDS was the right and conservative party, but had sort of this Christian church sort of identity, and obviously, I think just here, Portugal, and anywhere, the not the church's role, but individuals and their adherence or their their how they carry their faith in terms of folks might not have lost their religious sort of orientation, but they may not, they may choose to profess it in a different way, i.e., church attendance being down. And I think that's certainly been compounded by the pandemic of the last 2 years. And so it's interesting that the Shiga, I think, from what my read on it is they are more conservative, anti, and the conservatism is not, I don't think, coming from a religious, philosophical conservative standpoint. I think it's just parlayed a little bit by those catchphrases and those sound bites that that they feel and get captured by.
Yeah, it seems like with the almost disappearance of the CDS, because when you go from being the third political force when Paulo Portas was running the party to may not have one deputy in the parliament is kind of major. But it seems like with this election anyway, this election that is held today in Portugal, and with the PSD basically being around the 30%, more likely that's what it will be, between 30 to 32% of the vote. And then the left wing of the PS also losing, the Bloco de Esquerda and the Partido Comunista Português, the PCP and the left bloc also losing votes. And I believe PAN, the party for animal rights, also losing votes. The Livre, the other left-wing party, kind of maintaining. It seems like the PS was able to capture those votes from the left, but the PSD was not able to capture those votes from the right because they went to Chega, which, as we know, has 6-7, and they went to also the other one, IL, the Iniciativa Liberal, which is a new party. I mean, just created with in the last election 2 years ago for the first time, and only got like 1% of the vote. And now they'll get another, seems like they're on target to get anywhere between 5 to 6% of the vote. Or 4 to 6% of the vote. So it seems like the PSD is having a tougher time getting that so-called votes from the right, that the PS was able to do with this election from the left. Is that a pretty good reading from your perspective?
I think it is. And I think I would add to that, also, PS did just recently had, internal leadership elections. One of their elected members of the European Parliament decided to challenge the now re-elected, president of the party. So that, that created some serious internal divisions in terms of, that election. And after, everything was over, let's all, get on the same page and sing Kumbaya, which is, in theory, nice. But there also were some old party, I shouldn't say old in terms of age, but, some very experienced PSD party, stalwarts and folks that had been, in prior governments and had been as members of parliament for a long time, that were essentially, swept out and not asked to stick around and, be candidates in this election too. So, was there a segment of the, PSD voters or even PSD, party members that took a pass and didn't vote or didn't work as hard as they otherwise could have. I mean, there were just, I think, so many possibilities and so many variables that sort of, I think, went into this ultimate outcome that it's really hard to point the finger at just one or another thing. I think it was definitely a combination of these things. There were definitely some hurt feelings, and that's the thing. It's funny, not ideologically, obviously, but I think very often how the Socialist Party, the PS in Portugal, is very similar to the Republican Party here in terms of how they stick together and they keep their people in line, and good, bad, or indifferent. Again, at the end of the day, everyone is free to stay in that party or stay in accordance with that management, or go off and do something else. I mean, no one's really obligated to do any of this, right? They do it because they do it by choice, and whatever underlying reasons. But that's one of the things that I think that was also to their advantage was they've got a stable leadership who's governed, and had a way to they keep the party together. And there's always a malcontent, and there are always these small divisions here and there. But I think when you compare purely from the party standpoint and the party level, two very different realities between the PS and the PSD parties.
Indeed, that's interesting. That they have that correlation with the Republican Party here, where ideologically they're very different, because and I think it's been the leadership of Antonio Costa and the president of the party, who we both know, Carlos Cesar from the Azores. They've been able to whip their people into whip in a good sense, the majority whip, into a cohesive message.
No, for sure. I mean, and that's that's what wins elections at the end of the day. It's not only sort of keeping your people together, but it's also the the ground game of getting folks to vote. And when you have an active and successful ground game at a time where you also have an early voting option, that can also be very, very effective.
Indeed. We both have an Azorean-centric mind, as our good friend Congressman Jim Costa said in front of you and I at one of Vlad's legislative dialogues. I think it was one of his best lines when I think it was the president of the Republic of Portugal, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, made an affirmation, and everybody could make some or have some questions. And our good friend Jim Costa said, "Well, pardon me, Mr. President, but when it comes to the relationship between the United States and Portugal, I'm very Azore-centric." And so I think that we are both a little bit Azorean-centric for many reasons. Do you think that this might have any effect in the Azores? I mean, that coalition is very fragile, and we know. And the reason why it's very fragile is not because it's a coalition of the right. Coalitions of the left are very fragile as well. It's because it involves 5 political parties. I mean, and that's a job and a half. I mean, if it was a job and a half for Antonio Costa to do a geringonça with 3 forces, imagine José Manuel Bolhero's job in the Azores having 3 forces in government and 2 others in the parliament to deal with. Do you think this strengthening, I think is the right word, of the PS at a national level, where they're going to be governing basically by themselves or just with one force, with one political force? They won't need more than, take your pick, whichever one it is, and it may be only the Bloco de Esquerda, it may be only the PCP, which I don't think it will be, or it may be the Livre, who knows? And they may be able to govern by themselves. Do you think that might have any effect on the coalition in the Azores, or do you think this coalition seems to be pretty stable, that will govern for 4 years?
Well, obviously, nowadays anything's possible. I think the difference in the Azores is that the PS government that just lost, the Vasco government, they came off a position of having a majority. Right. And so, and I think that's one of the things that, is one of the better or worse, I guess, when you sort of run the table, right? Mm-hmm. And you have no one else to blame but yourselves in terms of, and I think that's we've seen that here. We have a situation right now, although it's a little bit quirky because of the rules of the United States Senate. But it was the case with the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, where the Republicans had control of both chambers of Congress and the White House. And here we have a situation where the Democrats have control of both chambers of Congress and the White House. A little bit more limited, obviously, because of those Senate rules, as I said. But with respect to the Azores, it is sort of the inverse of what the main central government is coming off of. I mean, the party, the current situation in the Azores, came as a result of, in part, of the PS losing their majority, right?
Sure.
And I also think that, which is an interesting sort of dynamic in this discussion, is that there's always the power of incumbency too. And I think that was a factor in the recent elections in the central government. I mean, yes, it was a coalition government, but it was a PS, government in terms of the government structure. I mean, they had the support of those two parties to govern, but those other parties didn't have members of the party, in the actual government. And so in the Azores, it is a little bit different in that you have, members of CDS in the government. The vice president of the regional government of the Azores, is from another party, not the PSD. So it'll be interesting to see, what happens if not only if this coalition, stays stable, but to what extent the power of incumbency may end up, being a factor, either if this coalition runs out of gas and elections are called, or if they're able to carry it through and use that as leverage, political leverage, when they're up and trying to do essentially what the PS just did in the central government.
Indeed. And one thing is about folks not voting. So abstention in Portugal has a tendency to be high, unfortunately, the last few elections. But the figures that are being given by, at least today anyway, by the political class, and of course by the numbers that press is given out, it's actually lower than 50%. It might end up being, about 48 to 49%. The last election was 51. But in the Azores, the numbers so far are around 63% of folks not voting. And I just, that is not good for democracy in general, or is it really?
It's not. The question I guess I would ask is, Tip O'Neill, the former Speaker of the House from Massachusetts, would always say that all politics are local, right?
Correct.
So, the Azorians, yes, they have 5 representatives of the Azores in the parliament, but does the electorate view it as sort of like, well, it's not exactly local for us, and there's always this sort of balance, and bounce back and forth 3-2 between the PS and the PSD. So does that cause the abstention to be a little bit higher? Was it bad weather? Apparently today the weather wasn't all that great in a couple of the islands. So again, there are a bunch of factors, but there's also been some pretty high abstention on in some of the local and regional elections of the Azores too. So when I was in office, good, bad, or indifferent, I can say, I mean, now it's a lot easier that I'm out, but I would even tell the constituents that would reach out, and I'd say, if you didn't exercise your right to vote, you lost your right to complain.
Right.
And whether it's here or anywhere, I mean, if someone has the democratic ability to vote for who their elected representatives and leaders are, and they choose to not do that. And interesting, because I was actually watching a little bit of the coverage earlier before we started, and every vote does count. And I was looking at it, and there was a district, and I can't remember exactly where it was, but on the screen they had both the PS and the PSD had 40.3% of the vote, but the PS got 2 seats in the parliament, and the PSD only got 1. And I wondered, and I said, well, how the heck is that possible when you have the identical percentage, 40.3, they both, and one party gets the extra seat? And as it turned out, in that district, the PS had 15 extra votes. That's what got them the extra seat.
Wow.
15.
Yeah, indeed. Well, all of this we've been discussing, how does this affect the Portuguese American community in the United States, or does it even affect us at all? I mean, we are a community of immigrants such as myself, but a community of firstborn such as yourself, and a community of second and third and fourth generation. We've been here a long time. If we are to, incorporating everyone that's been here since the 1800s up until now, do these elections affect us at all? Should Portuguese Americans vote in the Portuguese elections? We're always blamed for that. In other words, we always get this idea. I think the abstention rate for the communities overall is like in the 90s, and in the mid 90s. But we always get blamed that, oh, maybe, if we had, a little bit more or quite a few more folks voting, then they would listen to us a little bit better. I don't think it would, because we're tied to two deputies, so it's to two seats. So even if 100% of us voted, even if millions of us voted, it would still only be for two seats. We're limited to that. So, so your thoughts on that? I mean, I think that your citation there of the famous Tip O'Neill is great, because indeed all politics is local, and folks are living here, and especially if they're born here and they have dual citizenship because of something that they want to be tied to the land, or they have some property there, or they feel that, hey, I'd like to be a Portuguese citizen, to honor my parents or to honor my grandparents. I've had that happen. Folks get a hold of me because of that. But it's not like they're involved in the system. They don't know the political system that well, so they don't feel, they should vote. Your thoughts, first of all, on voting or not voting? Obviously, it's up to different people. And even though it's important for us to follow our politics in the so-called homeland, for some of us, it's our homeland or the homeland of our parents or grandparents. But I don't think there's any major difference between PS and PSD when it comes to dealing with the communities. I think the issues are going to be still the same, and that's not being pessimistic. I'm just being a realist. I think.
No, I would agree.
You may have a different take, and that's fine.
No, I agree. I mean, the idea of non-resident voting, is not foreign. So, I mean, U.S. Citizens that don't live in the U.S. or they may be living away, military or not. I mean, there are plenty of U.S. citizens that move back to the Azores, for example, that can vote in the presidential elections. That's what the law and law of the land permits. As it relates to Portugal, I mean, it seems that those Portuguese citizens here in the U.S. can actually vote in more elections than just for the presidential, right? So they can vote in the parliamentary as well, which is here. I'm not surprised by the number or the percentage of abstention. I mean, I think at the end of the day, you have folks that, and the numbers are probably minuscule, but you have folks that have a genuine financial or other, interests in what goes on in Portugal, and that number is probably, very, very small. Mm-hmm. Then you have those folks that might be more in tune because they've got, family and close friends that they still, stay in close contact with. That what happens in Portugal matters. But I think the percentage of abstention is just reflective of the fact that there's just a big disconnect, and whether it's those that I just mentioned or those of second and third generations. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the connection that they have that is most important to Portugal are their accessibility when it comes to consular services. If they have anything to deal with there. Or something that they might have to deal with themselves, whether it's citizenship or a study abroad or something that they might need to have some interface with the consular network with. And so, and obviously, we've talked, and as a former PALCUS board member, until the end of last year, I mean, PALCUS took a position to to call it for what it was, and that is just a complete just calamitous situation as it relates to the consular service, here in the U.S. There was a story today about, I guess, the Portuguese community in Madrid who were, registered to vote, and they were essentially not allowed to vote because of some, technicality in terms of the ballots and how they were handled, or if they didn't go out, or however it was. So, at the end of the day, I think, a lot of the politics speak as it relates to the U.S. is really lip service, because at the end of the day, if there was real genuine concern, they would make it a priority in their budget to fix what's going on here. And until that happens, there's really not much else to talk about, frankly.
Yeah, indeed, and that is one very good point. And the consular services are the true representative services of Portugal in the United States. And so Portuguese citizens that need any kind of service have to go to the consular services. And when folks want to have their death certificate of a parent that just died, basically stamped so they can send it to Portugal, or to send it somewhere. And it in some consular services it takes 6 months to do that, or 3 months, unheard of. So that's the first line of contact that you have, but it's also the first line of contact that a lot of folks in the American community have with Portugal if they want to go to Portugal, if they want to invest in Portugal, if they want to go know more information about Portugal from an investment standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, from a study abroad standpoint. And we saw that in the two major, and I'm just going to limit to those two, the PSD and the PS, in the two major candidates. It was like it wasn't even a problem. It wasn't even mentioned. The one that was here physical from the PSD, and the one that wasn't physical, that did some some Zooms and some virtual radio talk shows and things like that. It was like, let's not talk about the consular services because it's not an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of does put us at a point that we say, why even bother? Right.
Well, yeah. At the end of the day, whether it's a federal government, a state government, or a local government, and I did this for 8 years, when you draft and you implement a budget, that budget is your policy priority document. And if the consular service and the representation, outside of Portugal, but specifically here in the U.S., is not a priority, then just make it known that it's not a priority. Mm-hmm. Don't continue to elicit, people to get their citizenship and people to invest and everything else, and not actually provide the avenues to successfully do what needs to be done. And it just seems that in the Palcus example of sending a letter and highlighting all these issues and what you just mentioned about the two candidates, there's an answer for everything. Any particular issue that is brought up, there's an answer or a response for everything. And in many cases, those responses are just unfounded and not factual, and it's just a very different reality on the ground. So when I talked earlier about coming and giving the lip service, spare yourselves and spare everyone else the lip service, because at the end of the day, if fixing this is not a priority, then let's all not pretend to be fools, right? That may not be the most diplomatic way to address it, but I think both of us and many others have been around this issue for a very long time. And at the end of the day, it's only gotten worse. It's only gotten worse, and the current, the government that just wrapped up, and the foreign minister, not as a person, but as the person responsible for this whole area. I didn't participate in the Zoom, but if the remarks were similar to what we've heard, in years past, not just from him, but also from Secretary of State and prior Secretary of States of the government. At some point, you've got to sort of put your money where your mouth is and not just keep rehashing and talking about the same things. Meanwhile, the issues that we're talking about just continue to get worse and worse, and to the point of almost collapse. And so, if that's not going to be a priority, no problem. That's your choice. We're always going to find another way. I've said this for a long time, and open to criticism. It is what it is. But the one thing that I still, and maybe they do understand, they just choose not to talk about it. But the Portuguese community in any part of the U.S., the Portuguese communities wherever they're located, they are fully integrated wherever they live, wherever they work, wherever their kids are studying, and whatever they're doing. And whatever they do in terms of maintaining the Portuguese language, the culture, the traditions, they do because they want to. And the Portuguese governments, and not just this one, but I think the Portuguese governments of any political party for a very long time, as far as I've been following and paying attention, they have this idea that the Portuguese communities that are, here that I just referenced have some sort of an obligation, moral or otherwise, to do what they do. And that's just simply not reality. I mean, these folks do what they do because they want to, and because they think it's important to preserve for their family, for their communities and what have you. Don't be under any illusion that these folks are somehow obligated to do what they do. And the Portuguese mentality sometimes is, not only should you be obligated to do it, but you should also be proud of the fact that you're obligated to do it. And I don't think that really flies in 2022 anymore.
Sure, I don't think it ever did fly, but indeed, I think the responsibility are of those that are paid by the Portuguese government, well paid or badly paid, but are paid by the Portuguese government to be in representative services, whether it be in diplomatic, education, cultural, etc. And we have seen nothing can be done without these true volunteer heroes. And I mean, yeah, we have people in the community that volunteer, that maybe volunteer a little bit too much and for the wrong reasons, but most people in the community volunteer it's for the right reasons, and they have their hearts, and they have their heart in the right place, and it's a lot of work and they get nothing in return. So Dan, thank you so much. I promised it to be less than an hour, and I want to keep true to my to my promise. It's been fascinating as always. Portugal will not change much in my perspective. What is yours with this move, with these elections? I mean, this may be it's going to be tough, and I'm going to make just from a political analysis standpoint, people know where I stand politically in the Azores and mainland Portugal. People probably could tell who I voted for, but this is it's going to be tough for the PS to win elections after this 4 years, because that will give them basically one full term, one half term, and another full term. That's 10 years in power. I know that in the Azores, that's nothing. It seems like that's, that's not the tradition is that's nothing. But in mainland Portugal, it's a lot. I mean, it's going to be tough for the PS, even with a simple majority, to continuing governing if they do not reinvent themselves, and if this government is stable for the after this. It's not the easiest job in the world, and sometimes it's good for the country that there's these changes, because people become too comfortable with positions, that as well as you've seen, so it seems like the Portuguese people, from your take and my take, I agree wholeheartedly, just wanted some stability, and they figured this is the best way to get stability. But if the PS doesn't make some structural changes that are very important for the country, they're going to have some issues 4 years from now. I think that's something worth. A political pundit said this morning on the television, and I'm going to quote him. I don't recall his name, but he said that, and obviously he's from probably a different political party than I am, but he said something that's true, which is the last 27 years, the PS has been in power for 22, and so and we still are the third poorest country in Europe. So something has to change, and the two major political parties, just as like I wrote about a month and a half ago, when it came to the elections, and the deputies from the communities, I said, it's time that we look at people from the communities to be the head of these elections, and not to be there in a fifth or sixth or seventh place where they can never, hold that seat. And if we're going to blame the system, we basically have to be true to ourselves and only blame two parties: the PS, and the PS. They've been the only two parties ruling Portugal by themselves or with a coalition. It has never been the CDS ruling by itself, or the Bloc de Esquerda, the PCP, or anybody else. So what are your thoughts on, it's 4 years, they have a little bit more power to govern with, they don't have to pay a lot of lip service to the parties on the left, as we just they may be able to rule all by themselves, but if they don't, they only need maybe one political force. But at the end of these 4 years, there better be some results, or it may be a change may happen in Portugal. I mean, you can't go against these facts of the country still having some very dire economic situations.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do as well with who the leader is, right? I mean, Antonio Costa is not only a smart, politician, but I think he's generally someone who is well regarded by even people of different political opinions. I mean, it's for a guy like him who was part of the Socrates inner circle, and after that whole debacle, for him to not only survive but now thrive, on his own, and even his government's had some issues during the last 5 years. I mean, you had the foreign interior minister who resigned because his vehicle was involved in an accident where someone was killed. You had the tanks issue. I mean, there has been no shortage of we'll call them issues. I mean, some might have been borderline, in terms of scandals, but at the end of the day, he is still the leader that folks respect and deposit confidence in, for that stability that we began this conversation talking about. If he's not in the picture, I mean, that could change, a lot. And that sort of compares a bit to the internal politics of the PSD with the current president and the member of the European Parliament, Rangel, that ran against him. So that's the one thing I find interesting about the parliamentary system, right? Is that yes, folks vote for a party, and they're affiliated, obviously, with a party. But I think who the leader of that party is, also has a lot to do with how the party succeeds or no, or not, and how Antonio Costa actually came into power with the PS, right? He ended up taking out, the prior president, Seguro, that was an internal election, and so he obviously has, like I said, not only survived but thrived, and I think that he has a lot to do, and the sort of confidence and respect that the electorate has for him has a lot to do with the party's success, and whether or not he's, I mean, it's happened in past, right? Durão Barroso, who was prime minister, then went on to the European Commission, and that changed the dynamics of who took over for him, and they didn't last very long when elections took place. So,
Sure.
there's definitely a precedent for those types of dynamic changes that happen in Portugal, where the parties end up losing after the leader of the party, who's generally pretty well regarded, moves on to something else.
Yeah, indeed. If Antonio Costa moves on to something else, it will be a different ball game in 4 years from now. And you're absolutely right. I mean, he's a very savvy political leader, and he's brought the PS to win an election after the whole Socrates debacle is kudos to him. I mean, even and to make a geringonça to the left, because that was something that's a new term. That was something that no one thought would ever happen, and he was able to do it and make it work for 6 years. That's as you
and I think when it comes to the person and the personality, I think that exact sort of set of circumstances is applicable in the Azores too. I think that the coalition that's in the Azores is in large part to the persona and the manner that the current president, José Manuel Bolieiro, has always carried himself. He's a very serious guy. He's very well regarded and respected, even by those that are from different political parties. So I think they share similar characteristics in terms of how they sort of put people at ease, because they're comfortable, and they're just natural leaders. And I think that's carried their respective parties a long way as well.
Knowing the political system in Portugal, I mean, and the parliamentary system very well, and how these party's work, and now that the PS is strengthening a little bit, or came out of this election a little bit stronger, obviously, much stronger. Do you believe that there's been some political talk already, although it's still election day, but that's just the way it is in the political world about, and he himself had mentioned that, Antonio Costa, that there's going to be some changes. I mean, not just, changing person A to post B and person B to post C, but maybe some changes in personalities and in folks he's talked about younger members of his government, of having younger members in the government. Do you think there may be some changes coming up, or do you think we'll see the same faces that we saw the last 5 to 6 years? Well, what's your take on that?
I think there may be, it's one thing when you're, in this case, the prime minister, it's sort of, you're the boss and you call the shots. That's obviously a very exhausting, job and a very exhausting position. But I also think it's probably different when someone is a minister or is a secretary of state, somewhere, and you're, it's just as tiring. It's just as exhausting. Yes, you have, some latitude to sort of call the shots, within your ministry, but at the end of the day, there's always someone above you that calls the shots, and there may be things that you want to do, but that just doesn't go with the bigger plan, and you can't do it. And so I think there's probably room and probably some desire, frankly, for some of those folks for some just natural turnover. So that may very well happen.
Well, if it happens with the Secretary of State, that's the one that deals directly with the communities. Here we go all over again, which is visiting for the first time and trying to learn for the first time. And that's always been one of my pet peeves. I mean, let's read the reports that your prior, and in this case, it's of the same. If it is there is a change, it's within the same party. So they're believe that those are true reports, and let's continue with some of the politics, because it's tiring and it's cumbersome, and it gets totally demoralizing at the end of a few years for us who are in the community, in the diaspora in the United States and anywhere else, that these positions change. In this case it's changed. In 6 years there was 2 of them, and it seems like with everyone we start all over again, and it's there's a new there's a little bit of a time for a learning curve, and then when the learning curve is at the end of the learning curve, then all of a sudden that person goes and we have someone else new again. And even within the same political party, it doesn't seem like everything, there's no continuity. And for us in the communities, Dan, that's something that I think the younger generation, especially, well, you are the younger generation, yours and the younger generation and the generation before you, it really gets tiring to them, because they don't want to be saying the same speech over and over and over again.
Well, I think it's funny. I know we're probably running over time, but the one thing that is really interesting to me with respect to the Portuguese bureaucracy, really, if you're a minister of any department, right? The finance ministry, for example. I mean, you have the finance machine and the finance bureaucracy that's probably been there, for a long time. And the foreign ministry, when you talk specifically about embassies and consulates. I think, that's a whole other bureaucracy, in that it's a bureaucracy that in many, many cases is multi-generational, right? You have ambassadors, or you have consuls whose parents and grandparents were ambassadors, even back to the old Salazar regime. And so that becomes this sort of like recycled, group of folks, and in a lot of cases, I mean, they're more concerned about self-preservation in terms of, wherever they are and where their next spot is, as opposed to really carrying out, what should be done. Because for them, it's, and this is, again, I don't want to generalize everyone, but, I think we've here in the U.S. have had a number of instances where that, we can say that is the case. It's, I'm on this lily pad now, and, my main concern is the next lily pad that I'm jumping over to. And unless you have a minister and a secretary of state that is willing to sort of take on that diplomatic establishment and that diplomatic, machine, then you really can't expect to see, much done. Because there are other issues, other bigger issues that the foreign minister has to deal with regards to Portugal being a member of the EU and NATO and all these other geopolitical things that are happening, and the sort of the consulates are not a big issue. And plus, if you really want to try to fix the consular issue, and you have to sort of pick a fight with the diplomatic establishment, is that something you really want to do in the context of everything else you have going on? And unless you sort of give a Secretary of State, carte blanche to do what they think they need to do, and you're going to support them, then there's really there should be no expectation that anything's going to change and get better.
Well, that's a nice way of putting that. That not much will not change. But anyway, we'll see what happens. It's a new life for the PS with the same leader, but as you said, and I totally agree, very dynamic and really someone who understands politics in Portugal. Dan, thanks so much. Appreciate your time, and we hope to see you soon. Okay, take care, my friend.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.